When I bought my new table saw, one of the first projects I knocked out was a crosscut sled, which I consider to be an essential shop fixture. Now, there are all types of jigs and fixtures and sleds that you can have for your table saw, but a crosscut sled is one of the simplest, but it's also one of the most useful. Once you work a crosscut sled into your daily routine at the table saw, I guarantee you will wonder how you ever got by without it. Now, some people may not know exactly how these sleds work, so let me take a few steps back and show you how it's made. Every table saw can be equipped with a miter gauge to push wood perpendicular to the blade for crosscuts, but they don't offer much surface area at the fence. And while it makes sense to utilize the flat top of the saw, putting wood directly onto that surface is not ideal. Also, there's no two-handed grip, or really any grip options for pushing wood into the blade. The fix for all of these issues is the Crosscut Sled and its smaller friend. This sled offers a large bearing area to carry wood across the blade while kept in alignment with the integrated rear fence. The resulting crosscuts are consistently square. Here's how it's constructed. I made my crosscut sleds out of scrap wood and MDF that I already had in the shop. You can make them as nice as you want, but I prefer to spend as little as possible on making my shop jigs. Since I started out with thin stock, I had to laminate several layers of wood together for the fences. Of course, you could start off with some thicker material, and you'd save a few steps here. This old wood was already planed flat, so much of the milling process was already done. So I ripped these boards down to a rough size for the fences. Once all of the parts were broken down, I laid out smaller sizes that would ultimately be my final length. With a couple of crosscuts of the miter saw, I broke down the longer boards into more manageable pieces. Accuracy is not critical here, so these cuts can be made with pretty much any method. Although these boards were already flat, there were some spots of old paint still on the boards. A light pass or two on each side through the planer got these boards completely ready for glue up. As I spread the glue around on these boards, I was mostly just looking for complete coverage. I'll trim the edges later, so it can be messy. Then I set the glued stack up in some clamps to dry overnight. You can gain some efficiency by clamping the two fences together here. And then I waited. Feel free to spend your glue drying time as you wish. Foot tapping helps. The next day, I pulled the clamps off. These two stacks of laminated boards form both fences. When I was putting them together, I made sure to leave one joint in the middle that didn't have any glue. For the base of the sleds, I broke down a piece of 1/2-inch MDF on the table saw. These bases can really be made from any material you like, but plywood and MDF are usually easiest. Just make sure that it's a stable material that won't move a lot. The laminated boards that I pulled out of the clamps earlier would work just fine for the fences as is. I like to shape mine though, to make them more comfortable to hold. Then I cut out the curves for the fences on the bandsaw. Accuracy isn't all that important here, since this shaping is mostly just a personal preference. You could completely skip this step, and the fences would function just fine. I almost always follow up my bandsaw shaping cuts with this oscillating belt sander. By forming the wood in this method, I can sneak up on pretty much any shape with relative ease. Then I set up my palm router with a roundover bit. Only the top sides of the fence receive any rounding treatment. The bottom needs to be as flat and square as possible. Yeah, maybe one day I'll set up a router table in my shop, but for now, this is how it's done. After any type of edge rounding with a router, I typically go back and hand sand at least a little bit just to make sure it's all smooth. Once the fence shaping was done, I laid down some sanding sealer, which is pretty much just a thin coat of shellac. If I had used a denser wood for my fences, I would probably have just skipped this sealing step. And then I went to bed, and more time passed. The next day, I started by checking the width of my miter slots with a digital caliper. And it was freakishly dead on 3/4 of an inch. I still needed to make some rails to go underneath the sled, and there's quite a few different ways to make these, but I just run the boards through the planer until the thickness is pretty close to the width of the slot. There needs to be a little bit of room so the rail will slide smoothly in the slot. Then I ripped those rails to fit on the table saw. And since I started with a wider board, I can make quite a few of them. It makes sense to keep a few extra rails around for other fixtures. After fitting the rails in the slots and clamping them to the base, I flipped over the whole rig and drilled some pilot holes. Small, short screws are key here. You don't want to punch through to the other side. Once the rails were attached, I flipped the whole sled back over to check that the motion was smooth. Looks pretty good to me. I came back with a handsaw and took off the extra rail that was sticking out. A little bit of quick chisel work on the ends of the rails helps to ensure that the corners don't catch. And then I attached the fence. Now to square up that fence, I made 4 cuts using the sled. The next cut removed a narrow strip of the same material. This process of 5 cuts to a perfect crosscut sled was developed by William Ng. You can find further information on this method through William's videos. The basic premise is that you cut all 4 sides from the square and then come back and remove a strip from the first side. You then measure both ends of that strip. Using some basic math, you can reconcile how far out of square your fence is over a set length. And that length is basically just the distance between the 2 screws holding down the fence. Using a stop block and some feeler gauges, I set one side of the fence back by the distance that I calculated. And then I reinstalled the screw in the back of the fence. It took a few tries to get it perfectly dialed in, but the final result was 2 to 3 thousandths of an inch over approximately 21 inches. And that's good enough for me. I finished up the sled by adding a healthy coating of paste wax on the bottom side of the base. Then I gave the sled its first true pass over the saw. Nothing fancy here, just the bandsaw cutoffs from the fences that I just made. And the results were perfectly square. I used the same process to square the tiny sled. Although the larger one is my go-to sled for almost all of my shop work.
So there they are, folks, crosscut sleds. Safe to use, fun and easy to make, and as accurate as I need to produce consistent crosscuts. Now, speaking of accuracy, if you want some more information on that, there's plenty of resources available out there, and I'll leave some links below in the description. If you don't already have one of these sleds for your table saw, go bang one out this weekend. I guarantee you will not regret it. That's all we got here. I'm done with this one, so I'm on to the next project, and I hope you enjoyed the show.